Night has a way of making Alexandria feel like an inheritance, the sea breathing in the dark, the brine and resin from harbour masts, the lamps along the canopic way burning little suns into the mist. Somewhere behind the facades scribes tally grain and priests whisper to stone gods older than empires. But the palace is colder than the city tonight. Cleopatra has lost her throne. A year earlier she had stood beside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as the custom required co-rulers by a fiction as old as their dynasty. Now he has the courtiers, the regiments, the treasury locks. She has exile's dust and a dwindling circle of loyalists. Alexandria, city of philosophers and pilots, is still hers in the way a childhood home is still yours when your key no longer fits the door. And then Rome arrives, more precisely Rome's most dangerous man. Julius Caesar sails in with authority sharpened by civil war, and the recent ghost of Pompey, murdered on an Egyptian beach to win Roman favour that never comes. The city rearranges itself around him. Officials, frantic ambassadors, sleepless soldiers coiling like chains around the royal quarter. If Cleopatra is to return, she must pass through Caesar. The story of how she does it survives like a stage direction scrawled in the margin. Plutarch says she chooses a linen sack, the sort of thing servants carry without notice. 2 Confederates lash the cloth tight around her bundle, and hoist her past guards to Caesar's apartments. There unbound, she steps out laughing, hair raked by the journey eyes alive with calculation. It is a trick and also a declaration this is a queen who will not wait to be sent for. Caesar has conquered men by columns and treaties. She means to conquer him by audacity. What follows is not the romance of marble statues, but the politics of survival. Cleopatra wants a throne secured by the heirs. Caesar wants the East quiet and profitable. If they become lovers, it is not merely because they are both famous for being irresistible. It is because each recognizes the other's use. His legions will tip the balance against Ptolemy. Her Egypt, if loyal, can steady Rome's fracturing horizon. Yet outside their private bargains, the city's courtyards fill with soldiers, the harbour with masts, the narrow lanes with rumour. Ptolemy's partisans move first and the palace becomes a trap. The war that tears through Alexandria is fought in alleys and granaries among scroll cases and harbour sheds. Caesar burns ships to clear a line and the flames leap to the dockside warehouses, sending sparks over 1,000 roofs. Later Alexandrians will say the library itself burned that week. What exactly was lost will be argued for centuries, but everyone remembers the smoke that made noon into dusk. At the water's edge the fight turns. Ptolemy's forces break on Caesar's infantry, and the city used to seeing ships glide like fish across blue watches, bodies bump the pylons of the quay. The boy king flees and drowns in the Nile, the same river his ancestors learned to tax, to praise, to bribe with rituals. Caesar's standard flies over the palace again. Cleopatra stands where she began, but differently, she is sole ruler now. And for the first time the idea of a dynasty is not a ghost, but a strategy. The child is born in 46 BCE, and with him a test of every boundary in Mediterranean politics. He is named Ptolemy XV Caesar, Caesarion, little Caesar by the city's quick tongue. In Egyptian tradition, it is perfectly natural for a mother to rule in her son's name. Portraits and the reliefs have long shown queens as guardians, goddesses in human dress offering at the right order of the world to the gods on behalf of a divine child. Cleopatra knows the grammar of that symbolism. At Dendera she commissions a relief that stages the message explicitly. The boy, small yet solemn, makes offerings under Hathor's protection, while his mother looms beside him in the regalia of kingship. The stones speak with a clarity the street cannot. Egypt has a future and a name for it. But where Egypt sees continuity, Rome smells monarchy. The Republic is full of men who recite that it has no kings, even as they elbow one another to behave like kings in every arena. Caesar brings Cleopatra to Rome anyway, not because he is blind to scandal, but because he believes scandal will bend. He lodges her in a villa across the Tiber, lavish enough to bring the city's curiosity to a boil. The gold, the perfumes, the priests of Isis, the queen herself moving through the forums with a cat-calm assurance. The rumour of a child who might be Caesar's, each detail is an ember. Matrons peer from the litters. Senators whisper that the East has arrived wrapped in silk to persuade the West. To Cleopatra, the journey is not spectacle, but a wager. If Caesar will acknowledge Caesarion, then the boy's place is not merely on Egyptian walls, but in Roman law. She does not need Rome to hand her Egypt, but she would prefer that Rome not try to take it away. And if in some unimaginable future Caesar reaches for a crown, her son would be poised to inherit a world larger than the Nile can measure. The city cannot know whether that hope is madness or foresight. It only knows where it draws its red lines. When a gilded statue of Cleopatra appears near the Temple of Venus Genetrix, Rome, feels the nudge become a push. The old word Rex King rattles in mouths like a curse and a dare. Caesar at his zenith carries on as if outcomes are obedient. He reforms calendars, packs the Senate with loyalists, drafts plans for Parthia. For Cleopatra, time has a different texture. She thinks in the length of a regency, the age a prince begins to speak clearly. The interval between festivals, the patience it takes for an image in stone to seep into a people's sense of themselves. She knows that in Egypt, mother as regent is not a usurpation but a duty. Queens, like Ehotep and Hatshepsut, had steadied thrones with a combination of ritual and ruthlessness long before Rome learned to pronounce the Nile's name. If the Romans mock her as a sorceress, so be it. The sorcery in question is administration. Then March breaks like a blade. The Ides a Day, mapped by augurs and accountants, becomes the theatre of a different arithmetic, 23 wounds tallied into a republic's ledger. In the Curia, Caesar's body twitches under togas that used to be allies. Outside the city stares into the sudden hole where inevitability had been. Cleopatra hears the news inside a house that does not belong to her, in a city that would prefer she did not exist. Whatever she imagined recognition for her son, a stable pact with a single Roman master, dissolves into the old volatility. The daggers did not only open Caesar, they opened competition. Her calculation becomes survival again. In the streets, the assassins proclaim liberty, but liberty is only one party in a gathering of many. Mark Antony claims stewardship by intimacy. A slender heir named Octavian claims it by will and name. Cleopatra can read the script without hearing the actors. She withdraws. Rome is no longer a place where she can sell the future and purchase safety. Egypt, for all its dangers, has a grammar she trusts. So she returns to the water that has always been both subject and sovereign. The Nile runs high. Barges stack with grain that turns into coin in every port. Priests swing incense in halls cut with stars. In a palace garden, the air is heavy with lotus, and the small sound a child makes when he sleeps. His mother's arm is an old kind of government. She has seen how a city can be caught between applause and knives in a single breath. Here she thinks the work is slower and truer. Carve, the reliefs pay the soldiers. Teach the court to watch the boy as if he were already sacred. If Rome will not admit a little Caesar, Egypt will not ask permission to raise one. The city settles around her like a cloak, the markets, the workshops where glass is blown, like dawn trapped in a bubble, the docks where Phoenician captains shout to Nubian stevedores, the libraries where scholars argue about the movement of the moon and what it means for crops. Cleopatra walks through it with a double gaze, one eye on the immediate letters to write a temple, to dedicate a governor, to replace one eye on the mural of years she means to paint for her son. Caesar is gone. The men who fought beside him are aligning like stars, preparing for either navigation or omen. But in Alexandria the lamps along the Canopic Way glow, and the stone walls at Dendera whisper the same instruction over and over: hold, 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 until the child is old enough to stand where his ancestors stood and face whatever Rome has become. The sea once again carries a Roman fleet toward Egypt. But this time it is not Caesar who arrives, it is the man who inherited his armies and his ambition. Mark Antony. After Caesar's murder, the Republic split like a clay jar dropped from too great a height. In the vacuum left by his death, Antony, his friend, his general, believed himself the natural heir to Rome's power, but the will that was read aloud in the forum had another name in it: Octavian, Caesar's young grandnephew. To Antony this was a betrayal sealed in ink. To Octavian it was destiny. They agree grudgingly to rule together, each taking half of Rome's fractured empire, Octavian the west, Antony the east. But trust was already dead. Antony's new dominion was a string of provinces stretching from Greece to Syria, from the islands of the Aegean to the sands of Judea, a territory seething with debts, revolts, and the hungry expectations of soldiers still unpaid. He needed money grain and a steady ally who could steady the east while he dealt with the chaos left behind by Caesar's ghost. And so his gaze turned south toward Egypt, toward Cleopatra. It had been almost 4 years since she fled Rome after the Ides of March, carrying her infant son back down the Nile to safety. She had rebuilt her court with precision and care, neither declaring for the assassins nor for Antony or Octavian. She sent ships where profit was possible, envoys where silence was safer, and prayers to every god that might accept them. Now, In 41 BCE, a messenger from Antony arrived, commanding her presence in Tarsus ostensibly to answer for her loyalty to Rome, but in truth to see whether she was still useful. Cleopatra understood summonses better than anyone. They were not invitations, they were tests, and like before she decided that the only way to win was to turn the examination into theatre. She sailed to Tarsus not as a supplicant but as a miracle. Ancient chroniclers linger on the scene, a barge with silver oars, purple sails breathing in the wind, musicians playing flutes that shimmered like sunlight on water, and Cleopatra herself dressed as Isis, the living goddess of Egypt. Perfume spilled from the deck like smoke. Witnesses said the whole river smelled of myrrh. Antony the soldier, who had seen mountains of corpses, who had marched under snow and dust, waited open-mouthed on the riverbank. In that moment, Cleopatra understood that men who command armies still crave wonder, and she would give it to him endlessly. The dinner that followed sealed the alliance. Within days, it was also a love affair. To Cleopatra, love was rarely separate from politics. Caesar had restored her throne. Antony could protect it. He was impetuous, generous, and most importantly powerful in precisely the regions that bordered her realm. To Antony, she was a queen who spoke with the wit of a senator and the poise of a deity. She made his ambitions feel destined rather than reckless. For two people raised in courts where loyalty could not be trusted, the arrangement must have felt like relief disguised as desire. Their union produced more than a treaty. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The names were not chosen idly: Helios the sun, Selene the moon. Together they were cosmic children, heirs not merely to kingdoms, but to the eternal cycle of light and darkness. To the ancient mind, such naming was an act of creation. It aligned the family with the divine machinery of the universe itself. Egyptian courtiers whispered that the gods had returned in human form. Roman envoys muttered that Antony was falling under foreign magic. And then, as if the heavens themselves wished to comment, an eclipse shrouded the midday sky. The city fell silent. In Egypt, eclipses were not portents of doom, they were renewals, cosmic pauses in which the balance of order was momentarily tested and then restored. Priests at Dendera and Philae interpreted the shadow as an omen that the sun and moon had merged, that Helios and Selene had been recognized by the sky. Some years later, artisans carved their likenesses into stone at Dendera Temple, two small figures coiled by twin serpents, each crowned with its own celestial symbol, the disk for the boy, the crescent for the girl. To the Egyptians, serpents were protectors of divine birth. To the Greeks and Romans, they hinted at immortality. It was art as prophecy. In the coils of those snakes, Cleopatra was declaring that her dynasty was no mere mortal branch of power, it was cosmically ordained. But the heavens were less forgiving in Rome. By the time Antony returned to the west, the alliance with Octavian had begun to fray beyond repair. Antony had married Octavian's sister Octavia in a fragile bid to keep the peace, a political marriage to soothe the civil war. Yet as soon as he saw Cleopatra again, the balance tipped. He abandoned Octavia, returning to Alexandria to live openly with the queen. Together they built what the poet Horace would later call the court of a foreign god. They ruled as pharaoh and goddess seated on thrones of gold before an audience of envoys and generals dispensing decrees that reached from the Red Sea to Armenia. Cleopatra's wealth financed Antony's campaigns, her ships carried his soldiers, her symbols appeared beside his on coinage. For a moment the East and Egypt shared one pulse. The Roman world watched with fascination and growing dread. In 34 BCE, after a triumphant campaign in Armenia, Antony staged the donations of Alexandria, a spectacle that would be remembered as both magnificent and suicidal. Before a roaring Alexandrian crowd, Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones. Beside them, their children stood in miniature regalia, their crowns glinting in the desert light. Antony proclaimed Caesarion the child of Cleopatra and the late Julius Caesar as King of Kings, ruler of Egypt and all eastern lands that might one day bow to him. To the twins he granted dominions of their own. Alexander Helios received Armenia and Parthia. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. The youngest Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. The gesture was theatrical, yes, but in the ancient world theatre was governance. For Egypt it was a vision of restored empire. For Rome it was treason in costume. The Republic had spent generations priding itself on killing kings. Now one of its own generals was making them. The spectacle was the final proof Octavian needed. From this moment Antony would be portrayed not as Caesar's avenger, but as Egypt's slave bewitched by a queen who whispered foreign gods into Roman ears. In pamphlets and speeches, Octavian called him the drunkard of the East, mocked Cleopatra as the fatal woman, and spread coins depicting her profile opposite his, as if Rome itself were at war with her face. Yet inside Egypt, the mood was very different. For the first time in centuries, the country felt whole. Its queen enthroned her children, anointed its temples alive with music and purpose. On festival days, crowds filled the avenues between pylons carved with the forms of the royal family. The priests sang of Ra and of Isis, but also of new suns and moons rising over the horizon. The Nile shimmered with offerings, the city smelled of lotus honey and burning resin. It was an empire dreaming of renewal, unaware or unwilling to believe that another storm was already gathering to the west. In the sons between Antony and Octavian there was no room for two sons, and Cleopatra, whose life had always been about reading omens, must have looked at her children's names Helios and Selene, and wondered which would eclipse the other when Rome finally moved. For now, the Queen of Egypt lived between fire and reflection, the sun she had loved and the moon she had borne, one destined to rise, the other fated to fade. The Mediterranean was quieter than usual that autumn, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. The last harmony between Antony and Octavian had dissolved into the hiss of rumour and the scratch of quills drafting manifestos. In Rome, the marriage Antony had once used as truce, his union with Octavia, was now a public farce. She waited in the city with their children. He lived openly with Cleopatra in Alexandria, a queen seated beside him like a goddess resurrected. For years he had tried to divide his loyalties, one heart for Rome, one for the East, but now there were only two worlds left and they were drawing swords. The scandal was easy to weaponize. Octavian's envoys carried whispers across the empire. Antony was no longer Roman. He drank with foreign kings, paraded to himself as Osiris beside a woman who called herself Isis, and plotted to move the seat of empire from the Tiber to the Nile. That none of this was strictly true didn't matter. The truth in politics is whatever can be believed long enough to march an army. Then Octavian produced the ultimate theatre piece, a document no one should ever have seen. Antony's will sealed in the temple of Vesta, Rome's holiest vault. Only the priestesses were meant to guard it, but Octavian broke the taboo, stormed the sanctuary, and unrolled the parchment before the Senate like a conjurer revealing a curse. Its contents were incendiary. Antony intended to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. He had bequeathed Roman provinces to her children, and worst of all, he had named Caesarion Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar as Caesar's true heir. It was the perfect provocation. Octavian didn't have to declare war on a fellow Roman that would be illegal. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the temptress who had bewitched his rival and stolen Rome's destiny. The Senate roared its approval. The propaganda was complete. Antony was already dead in the spirit, and the war that followed would be branded as Rome's deliverance from Eastern decadence. The fleets assembled on opposite shores of Greece, two halves of an empire converging on its own reflection. Antony's armada, vast but slow, was drawn from Egypt and the eastern kingdoms. Octavian's, smaller but more disciplined, commanded by Agrippa, the quiet genius of the sea. On the eve of battle, the winds turned uneasy. Historians later wrote that an owl, a Roman omen of doom, settled on Antony's mast and would not leave. Actium, September 2nd, 30 BCE. Dawn cracked over a sea the colour of steel. Antony's ships, heavy with soldiers, moved to crush Octavian's line in one decisive blow. But Agrippa's lighter vessels danced out of reach, pelting them with firepots and arrows harrying them, until exhaustion became strategy. In the chaos, Cleopatra's royal squadron anchored near the centre, caught a gust of wind from the south. Her sails filled not toward battle but toward escape. The signal was unmistakable retreat, or betrayal. Antony saw the sails whitening against the horizon and made a choice no commander should make. He followed. Love, pride, or desperation, no one can say which ruled him in that instant. His fleet disintegrated without its master. Octavian's men moved in for the kill. The Sea of Actium boiled with fire and wreckage until the smoke rolled over the waves like a funeral shroud. For a year, Antony and Cleopatra clung to what fragments of empire remained. Alexandria, still jewelled and defiant, pretended that time had not shifted beneath its feet. Inside the palace, Cleopatra played both priestess and general, fortifying harbours, rallying loyalists, and staging feasts that felt less like celebrations and more like rehearsals for memory. Outside, Octavian's army closed in cold and efficient. When the walls trembled with the first assault, Cleopatra locked herself in her mausoleum, a sanctuary she had built in life as a rehearsal for death. Then came the rumour that shattered Antony's last resolve: Cleopatra was dead. Some messenger, whether through mistake or cunning, brought him the news that she had taken her life rather than be paraded through Rome. The man who had faced countless legions suddenly found himself unable to face a world without her. He fell on his sword, but the wound was clumsy mortal only by degrees. As his servants carried him to the mausoleum, word reached Cleopatra that he still lived. She ordered the doors opened. Antony, blood-soaked and fading, was lifted through the window by ropes and laid in her arms. "Do not mourn," he is said to have whispered. "Find a noble way to die." By the time Octavian entered the city, both fates were sealed. Cleopatra, cornered and stripped of illusions, understood her role in the victor's triumph. Rome loved nothing more than the spectacle of humiliation. She would be dragged through its streets, displayed before jeering crowds, a queen reduced to a cautionary tale. Instead, she arranged her own ending. Whether by serpent's bite or hidden poison, the method scarcely matters. What mattered was that the last Pharaoh of Egypt chose her death as she had chosen her lovers, with calculation, defiance, and an eye for symbolism. The asp sacred to Isis coiled at her wrist. Her servants found her calm, still crowned her face serene, as if she were already carved into relief. When the news reached Octavian, he allowed himself a single word: fortunate. He had won not just a war, but a myth. Egypt became a Roman province. Its treasures were catalogued, its temples rebranded as imperial estates, its gods quietly repainted in Roman colours. Caesarion, the boy who might have been both king and heir to Caesar, was hunted down in hiding along the Red Sea. 2 Caesars are one too many, Octavian remarked dryly, and the child was executed. The younger sons, Ptolemy Philadelphus and Alexander Helios, vanished from the record soon after, perhaps dead of illness, perhaps erased by decree. Only one daughter would carry the bloodline forward. Cleopatra Selene, twin of the vanished Helios, and last surviving child of Egypt's queen, was spared. Octavian understood the value of mercy when it could serve as theatre. He ordered the girl and her brother brought to Rome not as guests, but as trophies. The day of the triumph was Rome's greatest ritual of power, half parade, half sermon. From dawn, the streets filled with the smell of incense and sweat, the rattle of armour, the cheers of citizens eager to see what conquest looked like. At the head marched soldiers' faces painted with vermilion to mimic the gods of victory. Then came wagons laden with gold, ivory and silks, models of Alexandria in miniature, cages of exotic animals from the Nile, and at the last bound captives. Cleopatra's children were dressed for the role their mother had refused: Helios in robes embroidered with suns, Selene in silver and white, a crescent pinned to her hair. Heavy chains of gold were draped around their necks, ornament and punishment at once. The crowd gasped when they stumbled under the weight. For a moment, pity wrestled with patriotism. A few voices cried out for mercy, and Octavian, watching from his chariot, did not silence them. It served him better that Rome should see its new master as magnanimous. When the procession ended, the children were not executed. Octavian's genius lay in understanding that death ends stories, but survival can rewrite them. He entrusted the orphans to his sister Octavia, the same woman Antony had abandoned for their mother. To her, Octavian said simply, "Raise them as Romans." It was both a sentence and a strange form of redemption. So Cleopatra's dynasty, born in Greek ambition and Egyptian sunlight, entered the marble heart of its conqueror. In the flicker of a festival, one world had ended, and another had absorbed its heirs. The moon and the sun, once crowned before cheering Alexandrians, now played quietly in a Roman courtyard under the gaze of their guardian, a woman whose forgiveness was the empire's final act of discipline. The night wind over Actium had changed more than history's course, it had changed its language. From this moment on, Egypt would speak Latin in its decrees, Rome would whisper Greek in its poetry, and the daughter of a queen would grow up under a roof that smelled not of incense and myrrh, but of Roman stone cooled by twilight. The world had turned, and though the victors feasted, it was the children, small, silent, luminous, who carried the embers of what had been lost. Rome was an empire that prided itself on mercy when mercy cost it nothing. So the orphan-fainted daughter of Cleopatra did not die. Instead, she was rebranded. The marble house of Octavia stood on the Palatine cool in summer, fragrant with laurel and myrtle. From its terraces one could see the Tiber turning gold at dusk, and the distant roofs of the Forum where her mother's image had once been paraded in chains of imagination rather than iron. In this house, Cleopatra Selene, daughter of the Nile, was taught how to live like a Roman. Octavia, widow of one man and sister to another, who had become a god, ruled her household with the calm precision of a priestess. She was everything Cleopatra VII had been accused of not being modest, obedient, and Roman to the bone. Yet she was not cruel. The girl entrusted to her care was after all family the child of Antony, the man she had loved and lost to the east. Raising his daughter was not revenge, it was duty and perhaps atonement. Within those walls, Cleopatra Selene learned the arts that had polished generations of Roman women, weaving, reciting poetry, managing estates, and the delicate choreography of public virtue. Tutors from Alexandria, allowed by Octavia's tolerance, taught her Greek philosophy and astronomy. Priests of Vesta instructed her in household piety, the rituals that began each day at the Lararium, the little shrine near the hearth. There the household prayed to its Lares and Penates, spirits of home and lineage. For the daughter of Egypt, whose own gods wore falcon heads and carried ankhs, these small clay figures must have seemed strangely mute. Yet ritual was survival. Each offering of salt and wine to the hearth was another step in mastering the Roman mask she would need to wear. Outside Rome was changing shape. The civil wars were over. Octavian had become Augustus, the first emperor in everything but name, his power wrapped in the silk of peace. Statues of him multiplied across the empire, his youthful face an emblem of renewal. The Senate, the soldiers, the poets all sang of order restored. But in quiet corners whispers persisted that Antony's children still lived, that Egypt's blood still flowed within Rome's veins. Selene grew up in this contradiction, cherished and watched, praised and suspected. She was the daughter of a conquered queen, but also of a Roman hero. Her mother's name was whispered in scandal, her father's in sorrow. It taught her the most valuable lesson of survival, how to let people underestimate you while you learn their language. Among the other wards in Octavia's home was a boy about her age, Juba, the son of the late king of Numidia, defeated by Caesar decades before. When his father died, Juba had been paraded in Caesar's own triumph through the same streets where Antony's children had marched. He too had been given to Rome for safekeeping, a living trophy turned pupil. Juba was everything a Roman education could make of an enemy prince. He studied rhetoric under the best tutors, learned Latin so perfectly that even the Senate admired his speech and read the histories of his own people as if to memorize what he must never again become. Like Selene, he had been raised among the victors and trained to serve their myth. Two children of fallen kingdoms, two lives repurposed into ornaments of empire. When they met, perhaps first in the garden where fig trees shaded marble pools, they must have recognized each other's reflection. Both carried the same invisible inheritance, the ache of remembering another son. They shared tutors' meals and silences. Some evenings, perhaps, they spoke in the half-forgotten rhythms of Greek or Punic, whispering stories that smelled of cedar and sea salt instead of incense and oil lamps. In time, Octavia noticed. So did her brother. For Augustus, whose entire reign depended on appearances of unity, such a pair was useful. Two foreign heirs, educated, Romanized, and indebted, could become the perfect instruments of policy, and a marriage between them would be both a gift and a chain. When the proposal was made, it came not as romance, but as command. Yet in Rome, obedience could become its own kind of affection. Juba accepted first, proud to regain a crown even if it was Rome's gift. Selene accepted next, perhaps seeing in the arrangement the first glimmer of power she could call her own. The wedding took place with every symbol of Roman piety intact. The ceremony began at dawn in Octavia's courtyard. The air smelled of laurel smoke and crushed rose petals. The flammeum, the bride's veil, was a deep saffron colour, the hue of dawn and the hearth. Beneath it, Selene wore a simple white tunic tied with a woolen belt knotted in the sacred nodus Herculeus, to be untied only by her husband on their wedding night. Before the gathered guests, the priest invoked the gods of both homes, Jupiter, Juno and Venus, but perhaps in her heart Selene whispered another name, Isis. Then Octavia, acting as pronuba, joined the couple's right hands, sealing the union. Wine was shared, vows spoken, and the bride was formally taken from her guardian's house to her husband's, a symbolic crossing from childhood into sovereignty. The streets of Rome watched as the foreign prince and the Egyptian princess walked together through the forum surrounded by music and applause. Augustus himself appeared at the ceremony's edge, smiling that serene, unreadable smile he reserved for victories achieved without bloodshed. He had turned two potential threats into loyal instruments. Their marriage, though sanctioned by Rome, carried undercurrents neither Augustus nor Octavia could fully control. Both Juba and Selene were scholars shaped by loss and ambitious in ways that defied mere gratitude. Together they spoke of lands where desert met sea of cities rebuilt of kingdoms, governed not through chains but through trade and culture. To Augustus this was convenient imagination. To Selene it was strategy. When the ceremony ended, gifts were given bronze lamps, silver mirrors, ivory combs, and a carved figure of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The emperor's final gift was not an ornament but a throne. He named Juba and Selene king and queen of Mauritania, the semi-wild province on Africa's Atlantic edge, a land scarred by rebellion, but rich in promise. To the Romans it was a solution: remove the exotic heirs from the capital, place them far from intrigue, and let them serve as Rome's loyal mirrors abroad. To the couple it was exile with potential. As their ship departed from Ostia, Selene stood on the deck watching the Italian coast shrink into haze. The air smelled of salt and cedar. Somewhere below, a crate held the wedding gifts, a lamp, a small bronze Isis, and a handful of Alexandrian papyri she had smuggled from Octavia's library. Behind her, Rome glittered in the sunlight, the city that had taught her to survive by silence. Ahead the horizon opened toward Africa, where she would learn to rule by voice. Between them stretched the sea, half mirror, half grave, carrying a queen raised among conquerors toward the chance to reclaim her mother's dignity in another form. The daughter of the Nile was going home, though the land she was sailing to was not Egypt, and the throne waiting for her was not gilded in gold but in opportunity. The first sight of Mauritania was not grandeur but horizon, a long sweep of ochre cliffs and wild olive groves breaking into sea. For Cleopatra, Selene and Juba this was their promised kingdom, a gift, a challenge, and perhaps a test. The Romans called it Mauretania, the edge of their known world. To the locals it was older than Rome itself, land of wind, lion and salt, where Berber kings once buried their horses with them. The royal harbour they approached was Caesarea, once a Phoenician outpost, now little more than a scatter of warehouses and sand-choked streets. The name alone was a message chosen to honour Augustus, to whisper loyalty even from this far shore. But as the ship moored, Selene saw something else: potential. The coastline curved like a crescent, the same shape she had worn in her hair since childhood. The city could be a mirror not of Rome's marble perfection, but of her lost Alexandria, and she would build it that way. The work began immediately. Juba organised engineers, surveyors, and Roman architects. Selene gathered scribes, artisans, and the mathematicians she trusted from her mother's court. Together they designed a city of translation Roman in form Egyptian in soul. The streets were laid in a rational grid, the mark of imperial order, but they led toward a palace complex that shimmered with memory, columned courtyards in the Alexandrian-style lotus capitals beside Corinthian ones, a reflecting pool that caught the sea's light like a second sky. On the headlands they built a lighthouse modelled after the pharaohs, its fires visible far into the night, a promise to sailors and an echo to history. Each brick was an argument that Mauritania was not a backwater, but a continuation of civilization's lineage where African soil could host Hellenistic dreams. To the west the harbour was dredged and deepened. Shipyards rose, Roman galleys shared space with local fishing boats. Grain olive oil and fish sauce began to flow northward again, tribute and trade entwined. On the cliffs above, a theatre took shape, half carved into rock, half built from imported marble. It was the empire's favourite symbol performance as proof of order. Here Greek tragedies were performed beside Berber dances, Latin comedies beside Egyptian hymns. Citizens of many tongues gathered under one sky, and the king and queen sat among them, visible yet elevated, the living embodiment of unity staged for applause. Coins followed the first mass media of the ancient world. Their small silver faces carried messages more enduring than decrees. On one side the image of Juba II, crowned and bearded in Roman style, his profile strong, his Latin name ringing with loyalty, Rex Juba, Rex Augusti Amicus. On the other, Cleopatra Selene, veiled and serene, the crescent moon nestled above her brow, framed by the Greek legend Basilissa Cleopatra Selene. To the untrained eye it was simple symmetry. To those who understood politics it was revelation: Rome and Egypt, husband and wife, sun and moon, balancing one another across the silver surface of empire. The imagery deepened the myth. On later issues, Selene's coins bore symbols of Isis, the sistrum, the knot, the throne woven discreetly into Roman motifs. At the palace, a small shrine to Isis and Serapis stood between the audience hall and the royal apartments. Visitors who entered first saw Roman columns, then Greek statues, and finally the Egyptian reliefs bathed in lamplight. It was a diplomatic choreography in stone, a message to Rome that Mauritania was loyal, and a message to Africa that its god still lived. Selene understood that religion could be quieter than power, yet last longer than law. Where Augustus used temples of marble to deify order, she used ritual and architecture to deify continuity. Isis, reborn in Africa, became the goddess of transitions between desert and sea, east and west, mortal and divine. In honouring her, the queen honoured herself. But Caesarea's renewal was not only aesthetic, it was strategic. The kingdom lay between two worlds, the Mediterranean heart of empire and the uncharted Atlantic that still smelled of myth. Roman merchants came seeking gold dust and ivory. Local tribes brought salt horses and stories of lands beyond the western waves. Selene began to call her city the hinge of the world. Trade flowed through it like breath. Every shipment taxed, every market recorded, every caravan escorted by soldiers carrying standards marked with twin emblems, the eagle of Rome and the crescent of Selene. From the palace balcony, the queen could watch the torches along the seawall flicker into evening, the harbour's masts swaying like reeds. Below, Greek stonemasons and Berber traders shouted in 3 languages, while Egyptian scribes kept accounts on papyrus imported at royal expense. The sound was not chaos, it was rhythm, the pulse of a hybrid kingdom being born. Juba managed the scholars collecting scrolls for a library, modelled on the old one of Alexandria. Selene oversaw the artisans demanding that every fresco and mosaic tell a story, lotus blooms mingled with Roman laurel sphinxes resting beneath Latin inscriptions. The fusion was deliberate. Where Rome sought uniformity, she offered harmony through contrast. Visitors from the imperial court returned to Rome speaking of the city's brilliance, its shining harbour, its opulent villas, its peculiar beauty, neither entirely Roman nor wholly African. And Augustus, pragmatic as ever, nodded with approval. A loyal client king was one thing. A queen who could turn barbarian frontiers into cultural provinces was even better. Selene and Juba had done what no legion could, turned Mauritania into an idea Rome could live with. At night, the queen often walked alone along the mosaic corridors of her palace. In the hush, she could almost hear the murmur of the Nile behind the sound of the Atlantic surf. The air smelled of salt and cedar. A single oil lamp cast ripples of gold across the painted walls where moon and sun entwined. She would pause before a fresco showing the Pharaoh of Alexandria, the original lighthouse now half a world away, and think, I have built its twin, not to guide ships, but to remind the world that Egypt still shines through me. Caesarea, once forgotten, had become a living emblem, a city reborn from ruin, a message in stone that the daughter of Cleopatra had not vanished, but multiplied her mother's empire into another form. Here at the western edge of the known world, the Nile's light still flickered, reflected in marble minted in silver, and rising each night as the crescent moon over the sea. Inland beyond the salt wind and the gulls, the earth changed colour. Red dust gave way to green valleys, olive groves, and the scent of crushed figs. Here at the edge of the fertile plains, Juba and Cleopatra Selene built their second city, Volubilis, a quieter, more deliberate capital, where the rhythms of empire could take root beneath the noise of trade. If Caesarea was their window to the sea, Volubilis was the anchor that kept the kingdom steady. Its walls rose from the land like an answered prayer, limestone and clay, sun-baked to the colour of bone. Where the harbour city spoke in Latin and Greek, Volubilis spoke in grain. Its wide boulevards led not to harbours, but to markets, its plazas stacked high with olive jars and amphorae sealed in wax. Here the queen's ambition turned practical. Mauritania's prosperity was not drawn from conquest, but from harvest. Rain fell lightly in winter. The rest was labour. Farmers rose before dawn to plough the terraces, their oxen pulling wooden blades that traced geometry into the soil. Women carried baskets of olives to the stone presses, long rhythmic work, the sound of wood grinding against oil-slicked stone. The amphorae filled, sealed with clay, stamped by royal authority, Caesarea Regnum Maurorum. That seal was more than branding, it was proof of peace. The oil and grain from Volubilis fed Rome's markets and temples. Wine followed, crimson and fragrant, said to rival the best from Campania. And then came the strangest export of all, the sharp, briny product that made Roman banquets sing garum fermented fish sauce. Factories along the coast became small cities of vats and smoke. Workers dumped heaps of anchovies, salt and herbs into great stone basins left to rot under the sun until they liquefied into a golden, pungent syrup. The smell was legendary, vile up close, divine at a distance. Shipmasters carried jars of it northward as if transporting treasure. For the queen, each shipment was another thread woven between Africa and Rome. Trade was more than commerce. It was diplomacy in motion. Every amphora that reached the Tiber reminded senators that Egypt's daughter was no longer a threat, she was a supplier. The revenues filled Mauritania's coffers and gilded its temples, funding the mosaics, the libraries and the royal mint where Selene's crescent shone beside the eagle of Augustus. Luxury, when well managed, was the surest shield against suspicion. Yet the crown's true gold came not from the soil, but from the sea, from the western edge of their realm, where waves crashed against an island called Mogador, now Essaouira. From afar it looked barren, but its beaches glittered with something strange, shells sharp and spiked like tiny horns. Inside them lived the creature that had clothed emperors, the Murex snail. The dye-workers of Mogador were alchemists of patience. First came the harvest divers, pried the mollusks from rocks, piling them into baskets until the air stank of brine and decay. The shells were cracked open to reveal a small gland of pale fluid, less than a drop in each. Thousands were needed for a single thread. Then came the transfiguration, the liquid exposed to air, changing colour in a slow miracle yellow to green to turquoise, then finally to purple so deep it seemed to drink the sun. Only by such labour 12,000 shells for 1 gram of dye could a queen's robe exist. On the coast, entire quarters were devoted to the process. Smoke rose from kilns where linen and silk were steeped for weeks, their fibres absorbing the royal hue. When the wind shifted, the stench reached even the city walls, the perfume of power rank and unforgettable. But when the finished bolts of fabric were unfurled in the palace at Caesarea, the smell had vanished. In its place was radiance. Purple glowed in the torchlight like molten amethyst. Selene's robes shimmered between violet and wine red as she walked through the colonnades, the same shade reserved for emperors. At ceremonies, her attendants carried banners dyed in the same pigment fluttering against the marble, as if her own colour had learned to fly. To wear purple was not vanity, it was politics. In Rome, the dye was monopolised by imperial decree, a privilege of Augustus and his bloodline. In Mauritania, Selene wore it openly, claiming continuity with her mother's dynasty, and the divine sun-moon pair she had once represented. Each thread whispered that sovereignty was not a gift, but a legacy. Every audience with foreign envoys, every festival by the harbour, became a theatre of colour. When she entered, the court would fall silent not out of fear but awe. The room seemed to dim around her the way the desert dims before nightfall, waiting for the first silver edge of the moon. Purple paid for diplomacy. It clothed statues sent as gifts to Rome, draped temples built for Isis, and lined the coffins of allies who died under Mauritania's protection. Even Augustus himself wore Mauritanian purple in one of his later triumphs, a silent acknowledgement that his client queen had refined the empire's own iconography. The dye workshops thrived, their profits spilling into every layer of society: fishermen, merchants, artisans, priests. Purple was both the kingdom's perfume and its lifeblood. Still the queen knew the cost. She had walked the Mogador shore once, the wind whipping her hair, the workers bowing as she passed. Behind them lay mountains of broken shells, white as bone, gleaming under the sun, each shimmer a life crushed for beauty. She paused there, silent, listening to the tide pull through the wreckage. Power, she thought, always leaves behind its shells. Back in Volubilis, the rhythm of life continued. The city's main street, the Decumanus Maximus, rang with carts carrying amphorae oxen straining under grain sacks, children running beside them with reeds in their hands. Markets spilled into courtyards. Traders argued over coinage bearing her face. On festival days, priests of Isis processed through the olive groves, their garments edged in purple, their chants half Greek, half Berber. From the balcony of her inland palace, Selene could see the hills rising and falling like waves, green gold and distant. Somewhere beyond them, her dye workers crushed shells, her ships rode the tides. Her husband studied star maps and wrote histories. Empire was never built on marble alone. It was built on olives, on salt, on the backs of divers and slaves, on colour distilled from pain. But in the dusk, when the sky of Volubilis turned the same shade as her robe, Cleopatra Selene allowed herself a quiet pride. She had learned from Rome how to make peace profitable, and from Egypt how to make beauty immortal. The moon had found a new reflection not in the Nile, but in the purple light glimmering from the western sea. By the first years of the new century, Mauritania was no longer a frontier, it was a library written in stone. Under the slow patience of Juba and Cleopatra Selene, the kingdom had become a court of ideas, a meeting place for scholars, travellers and artisans from 3 continents. Ships that once carried war now brought scrolls, Merchants arrived from Cyrene and Athens, not just with spices or glass, but with the manuscripts, treatises on medicine, astronomy, and geography to fill the new royal library of Caesarea. Within its colonnades, scroll racks stood in ordered silence, their papyri wrapped in linen, and labelled in 3 scripts, Greek, Latin, and Punic. At its centre was a bronze statue of Isis, holding a sistrum in one hand and a stylus in the other, knowledge and devotion balanced. This was Selene's touch. If her mother's Alexandria had burned, she would resurrect its spirit in the western sun. Juba, for his part, wrote, "He was a king but also a scholar restless with questions. In his study, where the smell of cedar oil and ink mingled with salt air from the sea, he dictated to scribes his vast Libica, a history and geography of Africa that sought to reconcile myth with map. He described deserts crossed by nomads whose stars were their compass mountains that smoked with gods and islands in the Atlantic that sailors whispered of as the blessed. He sent expeditions to chart the Canary Isles, to study plants that healed or killed, to catalogue birds whose songs marked the seasons. He was in many ways the first African natural historian centuries before Pliny would echo his notes. Selene encouraged it all. She understood that scholarship was its own diplomacy, a way to civilize perception, to show Rome that this land was not barbarous but learned. She funded translators, cartographers, and architects. She restored old Berber sanctuaries with Greek facades and Egyptian symbols. Each project was an act of synthesis, weaving together what had once been divided by conquest. Her reign was not just about ruling, it was about editing history into coherence. Yet the heart of the palace was neither the archive nor the audience chamber, it was the shrines. Every morning before petitions began, Selene walked barefoot through the small temple courtyard, adjoining her private rooms. Here stood 3 altars, one to Isis, one to Serapis, and one to the Lares of the palace, adopted from Roman domestic rites. The incense curled upward, carrying both Egyptian hymns and Latin prayers. Servants from Numidia, Greece, and Alexandria knelt side by side. The queen had turned devotion into diplomacy, the divine order of her household reflecting the harmony she wished for her realm. In festivals, these blended rites became public theatre. When Isis's bark was carried through the streets during the Navigium Isidis, the people sang in Greek refrains while local priests cast millet into the air and Roman settlers applauded from balconies. It was not confusion, it was choreography. Each god was given a seat at the table of empire, each symbol a space to breathe. Selene's talent lay in this: she made coexistence feel sacred. Then, one spring morning, around 10 BCE, the palace filled with the music of birth cries and conch shells. A son was born, dark-eyed, calm, his fingers curled as if already grasping something invisible. They named him Ptolemy. The choice was audacious. In a world where Rome decided names, where kings now adopted the praenomen of their patrons, Selene reclaimed her lineage outright. It was a resurrection in syllables. By naming her child after her mother's dynasty, she declared that the blood of Egypt still flowed unbroken into the West. This was not mere nostalgia, it was brand strategy written in flesh. The name was a banner, a legal fiction, and a spiritual truth. Cleopatra's line had not ended in the Nile's mud, but had crossed an ocean of politics to live again. Juba, ever pragmatic, consented. He saw that the name could strengthen their throne by linking it to a legend. Rome might smile indulgently at the sentiment, but the Berber tribes, the Greek merchants, and the Egyptian settlers in the city all understood its significance. The queen had given them continuity, the king had given it form. Soon after, coins appeared bearing a new motif, a crescent and star, the moon of Selene, the reborn dynasty's emblem rising beside the sun of Juba. On one issue, the child's name, Ptolemaios Basileus, appeared beneath a small diadem, an image so subtle that only scholars noticed its provocation. In another, the crescent embraced a small star at its heart, symbolizing both maternity and succession, the mother's light nurturing the heir's flame. These were more than monetary tokens. They were statements of identity carried through every market from Tingis to Carthage. As merchants counted the silver, they spread the message of new Ptolemy rules in the far west. To the Romans it was harmless exoticism. To those who remembered the songs of Alexandria, it was defiance gilded in silver. Court life under Selene and Juba grew into a rhythm of ceremony and scholarship. Embassies from Cyrenaica and Hispania brought tribute. Poets recited verses comparing the royal couple to Osiris and Isis, to Apollo and Diana. Children in the palace school studied geometry in Greek and legal codes in Satin. And every month the queen ordered that the royal archives record not only treaties and taxes, but astronomical events, the births of stars, the cycles of the moon, the moments when light bent back upon itself. She was rebuilding memory as policy. Even the artisans felt her influence. Palace frescoes began to blend styles. Egyptian lotuses twined with Roman acanthus leaves, Nubian gold leaf beside Italian pigment. The fusion was deliberate, a political language in pigment. We are all parts of one world, and I am its mirror. For Selene, motherhood did not soften ambition, it sharpened it. Every ritual, every architectural choice, every minted coin was part of what she privately called her restoration. The dream of her youth, an Egypt reborn under her mother's crescent, had found new soil in Africa's west. She did not need to reclaim the Nile, she had rerouted it symbolically. Its waters now flowed through Caesaria's fountains and Volubilis's olive presses, nourishing a hybrid empire that would outlast dynasties. At night, when the court's music faded, she would walk to the balcony outside her library. The stars above Mauritania were clearer than those of Alexandria, vast and close, as if she could reach up and pluck one. Below the sea, glimmered faintly in the moonlight, its surface rippling with that familiar silver hue. In the distance, a temple torch flickered beside the shrine of Isis, its flames steady, its smoke trailing east. She smiled, knowing that even if history forgot her name, it would remember her symbols, the crescent, the star, and the quiet light of continuity carried westward across the sea. In the 35th year of her life, the light that had travelled from Alexandria to Africa began to dim. The poets of the age would later say that when Cleopatra Selene died, the moon itself went dark. One anonymous elegy recorded that the night wept her mirror. Selene descended, and the heavens closed their eyes. It was not mere metaphor. The year was around 5 BCE, and over Mauritania, a lunar eclipse rose a silent celestial requiem. The sun slipped behind the world. The queen's namesake bled copper, then vanished into shadow. For a few moments, darkness ruled both sky and palace. Juba stood on the terrace, the torches behind him guttering in the wind. All his maps, his scrolls, his catalogues of distant islands suddenly meant nothing. He had charted the world from the Atlas Mountains to the Canaries, but not this, the sudden unmapping of a life. In the courtyard below, the priests of Isis murmured hymns, their voices low as surf. Inside the body lay wrapped in linen and cedar oil, her hands folded upon her breast, a crescent carved in ivory resting between them. Even in death she looked prepared for an audience, as if history itself might appear to pay its respects. The queen's funeral procession wound through Caesarea at dawn. Citizens lined the colonnaded streets carrying lotus and laurel. They came not out of compulsion but affection. Selene had ruled with a scholar's mind and a mother's steadiness. Drummers kept slow time as the bier passed beneath the half-built triumphal arch she had commissioned, its marble still rough, its scaffolds draped in purple cloth. Behind her a small boy walked solemn and dazed, holding his father's hand, Ptolemy now king. In him 2 empires briefly clasped hands again. Juba decreed that her tomb be unlike any other, a monument that would speak in the same architectural tongue as Augustus's new Rome. The royal mausoleum of Mauritania rose on a hill near Tarsus, where sea and desert touched. Its base was round its dome immense, a drum of stone encircled by colonnades, blending the Greek tholos with the precision of Roman engineering. It was an act of love and rivalry. If Augustus had built a mausoleum for himself on the Tiber, then Juba would build one to match it on the edge of Africa. Its limestone once gleamed like pearl, bronze doors guarded the entrance. Inside, corridors wound toward a sealed chamber where 2 sarcophagi waited, one already occupied, one reserved. Centuries later, storms would strip away the marble skin robbers, would pry at its heart, and its treasures would vanish into dust. Yet even in ruin, the structure endures, a mountain of intention still commanding the coastline like a lighthouse turned to stone. At sunset, the dome glows faintly pink, as if remembering the colour of the queen's robes. Locals call it Kuba Rumia, the tomb of the Christian woman, unaware, or unwilling to remember that the woman inside once called herself the moon. After her death, Ptolemy ascended under his father's watch. Coins were struck bearing the boy's name beside the familiar crescent and star. The dynasty continued, but something quieter settled over the kingdom. The energy that had once radiated from Selene's vision began to disperse, absorbed by a Rome's widening gravity. Juba aged into scholarship, his library swelling while his influence waned. When he too was entombed beside her, the empire he had helped weave held together not by love but by habit. Ptolemy would rule ably for a time until ambition outpaced diplomacy and the claws of Rome finally closed. Within a generation, Mauritania was annexed, its royal bloodline absorbed into the imperial tapestry its kings remembered, as footnotes its queen as myth. And yet if history tends to glorify collapse, Selene's serenity escaped it. Her mother's life ended in spectacle as asp and legend. Her own ended in continuity, a rarer triumph. She built cities that lasted, economies that fed, and a kingdom that did not need saving. Perhaps that's why chroniclers overlooked her success, leaves fewer ruins to excavate. Her story survives not in the drama of endings, but in the quiet persistence of form streets still aligned to the sea coin, still whispering crescent and star temples, still half Egyptian in their proportions. Today the royal mausoleum stands among dry grasses and the hum of cicadas. Tourists climb its worn steps, tracing fingers over the eroded carvings. Few know whose dream they are touching. From its summit the view opens toward the Mediterranean, a mirror of light that once carried ships between continents, between languages, between memories. The air smells faintly of salt and time. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the sea folding against the rocks below, the same rhythm that lulled a queen to sleep 2,000 years ago. The historians walk here softly. They speak in low tones as if afraid to disturb what remains, because in these stones lies a rare kind of victory, the victory of endurance over spectacle. Cleopatra Selene did not burn like her mother. She reflected, she refracted, she lasted. Her kingdom once glowed purple at the edge of the known world, a moonlit echo of empires gone before. The stones remember, the names fade. But when the evening light turns the dome of her tomb to silver, the past stirs and the daughter of Cleopatra rises once more, quiet, luminous, eternal. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.